We're here on the banks of the Pottawatomie Creek here in southeast Kansas, and this rather mild creek is now the site of history in America. This would be the modus operandi of John Brown in his career as a terrorist, would be to come to people's homes, unsuspecting civilians' homes, and either kill them or kidnap them very late at night when they were asleep. We're here on a road that goes through the claim of a settler named Mensig, who was here in southeast Kansas, and this is actually the first place that John Brown came late on the night of the 24th of May in 1856. He came to Mensig's cabin, which was right near where I'm standing. When John Brown and his sons and his son-in-law and two other men came to Mensig's cabin, they knocked on the door, but the only sound that they heard was a rifle being cocked. They didn't have the guts to deal with the cocked rifle, so they crept away as silent as they had come. At the Doyle cabin, James and Mahala Doyle were sound asleep with their 4 sons and daughter in their log cabin that they had built here on their property in the prairies of Kansas. At about 11 o'clock at night, the Doyles were awakened by rapping on the door. James Doyle opened the door, and in forced his way John Brown, 3 of his sons, his son-in-law Henry Thompson. They asked James Doyle to please come out of the house. The next morning, they found James Doyle. He was shot through the head as well as slashed through the head with a sword. They found 20-year-old Drury Doyle's body near the cabin. All of his fingers had been cut off, his arms had been cut off, and his head had been smashed with a sword. The lifeless bodies were found the next day by Mahala Doyle. She was never the same after that. She left very soon Kansas for good and went back to her native Tennessee. From the Doyle residence, John Brown and his party went to the next adjacent property that I'm showing in this direction. This was the 160-acre claim of Allen Wilkinson. John Brown, of course, knew Allen Wilkinson from his duties as the local postmaster. He also knew that Allen Wilkinson was pro-Southern in his sentiments, in his political sentiments. That was made clear by the fact that he participated in these court proceedings on April 21st. In John Brown's mind, it associated him with the enemy. And it didn't matter that Allen Wilkinson really had never engaged in any violence or anything that directly attacked the Free State settlers, and he had no slaves or anything of that nature. His political beliefs made him an enemy, and from the Doyle cabin, John Brown went to the Wilkinson cabin, and there, it was after midnight when the dogs started barking at the Wilkinson cabin, and they started barking and raging, and Louisa Wilkinson was awakened. She was in bed with her husband Allen, and they had 2 small children with them. And she asked her husband, "What is it?" He said, "It's nothing, just someone passing by." But a moment later, she heard the dogs again. It wasn't nothing. In fact, the dogs were being killed by the people outside, and soon the people came to the door, rapped on the door, and demanded, "Please open this up or we'll break it down." "What do you want?" asked Allen Wilkinson. "We want to know the way to Dutch Henry's." "All right, I'll tell you." No, let us in so you can tell us how to go there. They insisted on coming in. Although Louisa tried to tell Allen not to open the door, he did open the door. And when he opened it, John Brown came in with 3 of his sons and his son-in-law. He said, "We're from the Northern Army. You're under arrest. You are a prisoner." He then told Louisa and Allen Wilkinson, "We won't hurt you. We want you to personally show us how to go to Dutch Henry's." Louisa said, "Can he put his boots on to show you?" "No, he doesn't have time for that." And so they took Allen Wilkinson out in his stocking feet in the middle of the night to show them how to go to Dutch Henry's. Well, he would never return. The next morning, he was found about 200 yards away from the cabin. His head had been smashed with a sword. His throat had been cut 2 times. He had received 6 different wounds, any one of which would have been fatal. The next morning, when these bodies were found, when the tales were heard from the wives of what had happened, it touched off a panic. Really, it touched off reaction in the local people, a reaction of horror, the typical reaction that happens from a terrorist attack. These were, no matter what their political views, they were civilians. They weren't engage in any conflict. There had been no violence in this area at all before this event happened. Interestingly, that since the Pottawatomie Massacre, as this has come to be called, since then, there's been a whole legend that's grown up around this massacre, a whole legend that, oh, James Doyle secretly was a very evil man, that, Dutch Henry had threatened the life of people who were Free State settlers. Oh, Dutch Henry had committed outrages against Free State settlers. Careful investigation by historians has found there is no substance for any of those claims. Those are actually claims that have been invented to justify, to make people who agree with John Brown's ideals and his cause feel better about the fact that the man himself was a terrorist. They've tried to justify what he did by making up essentially a whole legend around this massacre. But the brutal and bare facts are this was a cold-blooded murder of innocent people who were picked out because they were identified with the court. They were identified with a government that John Brown felt was illegitimate. And the method that he chose to attack those people is very similar to the method that we see today in places like Afghanistan or Syria, in places that are racked by terrorism. Really, this Kansas episode was very similar to those episodes in that the victims were not combatants. They were people who were selected because they were viewed as being symbolic of an enemy. John Brown was here to confront an enemy. He believed that God had sent him on this mission. His letters reflect that. When he wrote to his family immediately after this massacre, he reported back to his family. He didn't tell them the details of what had happened. In fact, he never really confessed to what had happened here. But he did kind of indirectly mention in his letter when he said, God will be the judge of what we've done here. That was his view, was that God justified these cold-blooded murders and that God was on his side and that justified what he did. It's very, very similar to the terrorists we see acting today in the name of what is perceived to be their God. And that's why John Brown, this primordial terrorist, is being featured in our series on profiles in terrorism.